We've already reviewed the idea of lines and their slope, but now we're going to move into different types of functions and look a little more at reviewing how functions work and the terminology that goes behind them. Consider something like c equals 5x plus 100. Notice we could just as easily write that as y equals 5x plus 100, but sometimes we're dealing with something specific, perhaps cost. In this case, notice that 5 is a slope, which just means that something is changing. It's going up, in this case, at a rate of 5. And this value is a fixed value. It is the intercept that doesn't change. In this case, this fixed value may represent something such as rent. And maybe we're trying to figure out the cost of creating, and it varies based on how much product we make. We would then represent this, perhaps we want to know the cost of making 100 items. So C of 100 would be 5 times 100 plus 100. Or if we want to know the cost of making 210 items, we would do 5 times 210 plus 100. We can use this function to calculate various values. Note, this corresponds to an x value, and then the calculation corresponds to the cost or the y value. In basic terms, if we have something like f of 4 equals 2, that means we want to know the value of the function when x is 4 is 2. In other words, when x is 4, y is 2. F of x is simply a fancy way to write y. Another area of terminology that we need to focus on is the idea of domain and range and the definition of a function. If we let the domain and range be two sets of real numbers, then the function is the rule that tells us how each x relates to exactly one y in the range. Please note there is only one y for each x. And hopefully you remember the concept of the vertical line test. Notice if I have a circle, it does not pass the vertical line test because this x corresponds to both of these y values. In contrast, something such as a parabola, each x only corresponds to one y. There's no vertical line that hits twice. You may also hear domain and range referred to as the input is the domain, and that gives us an output, which is the range. You need to be able to calculate these values, and let's practice that. If we have a function rule, f of x is equal to x squared, that means we take whatever is here and we plug it in for x. This will then become 3 squared, which is 9. Likewise here, using the same rule, 5 squared is 25. Do be extremely careful when dealing with negatives. It is negative 2 squared, which comes out to a positive 4. Sometimes there's a little more complicated function. Do not do anything differently. So for example, here, I'm going to first calculate f of 5, which following this rule will be 5 squared minus 8 times 5, which gives me 25 minus 40. And then for this, I'm going to have 2 squared minus 8 times 2, which gives me 4 minus 16. So f of 5 is going to give me negative 15. F of 2 is going to give me negative 12. And so negative 15 minus negative 12 results in negative 3. Do be careful with those double negatives. Likewise, we can still use the rule even when variables are still involved. I'm going to take this whole thing and substitute it into x. This will then become x plus h squared minus 8 times x plus h. I need to square this using FOIL, which becomes x squared plus 2xh plus h squared minus 8x minus 8h. There are no like terms, so it remains. Being able to understand these rules of functions comes in handy when we're dealing with word problems. For example, here, if we have a real estate broker that charges 6% sales on properties up to $300,000, and for those above $300,000, she charges a $6,000 flat fee plus a 4% sales tax, we can write a function. Her revenue is going to become two different calculations. It's either going to be 6% times the cost if the cost is between 0 and 300,000, or the amount she brings in will be 4% plus that flat fee if the cost of the property is above 300,000. This then allows us to calculate if we have perhaps a $200,000 house. We have to decide which rule it applies to. Notice 200,000 falls into this category. And so we would do 0.06 times 200,000, which is going to result in a $12,000 amount for the broker. Or if we are calculating perhaps a revenue for a house that is 500,000, then we would do 0.04 times 500,000 plus the flat rate of 6,000, which results in an amount of 26,000. Finally, there are some times when the domain or the X values that we can use are affected. The normal times that happens is when there is a variable in the fraction, the denominator, or when there is a radical. If you remember, we cannot take the square root of negative numbers, and we cannot divide by 0. So anytime there's a variable in the denominator, we are going to take that denominator and restrict it to be something other than 0. It can be negative, it just can't be 0. So we'll add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2, or x cannot be 2. It can be anything above or below 2. And for radicals, I know that the value under the radical has to be positive. So it has to be greater than or equal to 0. I add 2 to both sides, and x can be anything bigger than 0.